My sister-in-law threw a plate of food at my 9-year-old son because he finished his homework before her daughter did. She thought I would smooth it over the way I always had. She thought I would apologize on his behalf and make everyone comfortable again. She was wrong. I work as a licensed occupational therapist at a pediatric rehab clinic, and my days are spent teaching injured children how to hold a fork, button a shirt, and trust their bodies again after something terrible happened to them. I am patient by training and by necessity. I do not raise my voice at work. I do not panic in the middle of a session when a child is screaming and their parent is crying and the insurance authorization hasn't come through. I compartmentalize and I problem solve and I hold it together. But the second I saw my son Eli standing in the corner of my brother's kitchen, shoulders up around his ears, a streak of spaghetti sauce on his cheek, and tears tracking silently down his face, every clinical skill I had ever built collapsed like a wall hit by a wrecking ball. The drive over had been ordinary. It was a Tuesday in early March, and my brother Patrick had texted me that afternoon asking if Eli could come over after school because his daughter Chloe wanted company while she did her 3rd grade homework packet. Patrick's wife, Renee, had taken it upon herself to enroll Chloe in an accelerated learning program that required 2 hours of supplemental work every evening, and apparently Chloe was more cooperative when another kid was sitting across the table from her. I said yes because I always said yes. I had been saying yes to my brother's family for 4 years. They lived in the house I co-owned with Patrick. We had bought it together after our mom died, splitting the down payment from her life insurance policy. It was a practical arrangement at the time. Patrick was between jobs, Renee was pregnant, and the house was a 3-bedroom craftsman in a good school district in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. I already had my own apartment near the clinic, so I let them live there full-time in exchange for Patrick covering the mortgage and utilities. On paper, it sounded equitable. In practice, Patrick's consulting income was inconsistent. I covered the mortgage difference quietly at least 4 or 5 times a year, and I had never once asked to be paid back. Because family helps family. That was the deal. What I drove up to that Tuesday evening was a lit house, with a car in the driveway that I didn't recognize, which meant Renee had company. I parked on the street and walked up the front path. Through the front window, I could see the living room was empty. I could hear voices in the kitchen. I let myself in the front door with my key the way I always did, called out a quick, "It's me," and followed the sound of raised voices down the hallway. Renee was standing at the kitchen counter. She was wearing the kind of matching athleisure set she wore when she wanted to look effortlessly put together, which meant she had known in advance someone was coming over. Her friend, a woman I'd seen twice at birthday parties, was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of white wine. Chloe was at the far end of the table, her homework untouched in front of her, staring at her lap. And Eli, my son, was standing in the corner between the refrigerator and the wall, and there was food on his face and his shirt and on the floor around him. He saw me before anyone else did. The sound he made when he saw me was not a cry. It was a release, something that had been locked in his chest that finally found a way out. He moved toward me, and I went to him, and I crouched down and put both hands on his face, turning it gently toward the light, and I saw the sauce. And I saw that he had not been crying long, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and I saw that his hands were shaking. "What happened?" I said. I said it quietly, and I said it to him, not to the room. "She threw it," Eli whispered. He was 9. He whispered things when he was frightened. "She threw my bowl." I looked up at Renee. She was already in motion, already doing the thing she always did when she was about to defend herself, which was to speak very quickly and very loudly, so that her version of events occupied all the available air in the room before anyone else could fill it. "He was bragging," she said. Chloe was struggling with her math, and he kept announcing that he'd already finished. He kept saying it over and over, and Chloe started crying, and I asked him twice to please stop making comments, and he just kept going, and I lost my patience for 1 second, and I moved his bowl and it slipped. "It was an accident." "It slipped," I repeated. "It was an accident." I stood up. I kept my hand on Eli's shoulder. I looked at the bowl on the floor. At the radius of the splatter, at the height of the sauce streak on the cabinet behind where my son had been sitting. And I thought about trajectory, the way I thought about it when I was assessing a child's range of motion at work. And I understood with complete clinical certainty that a ball does not travel that distance or that height if it slips. "We're going to go," I said. "Don't be dramatic," Renee said. "He needs to learn that. We're going to go now." Her friend was very still at the table. Chloe hadn't looked up. Patrick was not in the room. I picked up Eli's backpack from the hook by the door, and I walked him out the same way I had walked in, and I buckled him into the back seat, and I drove 2 blocks, and then I pulled over because my hands were shaking now too. "Did it hit you?" I asked. I was looking at him in the rearview mirror. The bowl didn't. Some of the food did. He touched his cheek. "It's hot. The pasta was hot, Mom. My stomach went cold." "Does it hurt?" "A little. It kind of stings. Pasta fresh off the stove. Thrown hard enough to reach the cabinet. Hot enough to sting." I drove to urgent care. The nurse at the check-in desk asked me the reason for our visit, and I said my son had hot food thrown at him by an adult, and I wanted it documented. She looked at Eli's cheek and arm where a faint pink flush was visible under the overhead light, and we were called back within 10 minutes. The doctor, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Patel, examined the redness carefully. She told me it was a first-degree irritation, not a burn in the technical sense, that the pasta had not been hot enough or in contact long enough to cause blistering, but that it was clearly painful and clearly the result of impact rather than accident. She took photographs for the file. She told me she was a mandatory reporter and asked me to describe the incident. I described it exactly as Eli had told it to me and exactly as I had observed the physical evidence. She wrote everything down. She told me that given the adult involved, the child's age and the described intent, she was recommending I file a police report. My phone had been buzzing the entire time we were in the exam room. I looked at it when we got back to the car. 3 calls from Patrick, 1 text from Renee. I opened Renee's text first. "You're overreacting." Eli was being incredibly rude and unsympathetic to Chloe for a full hour. "I am a grown adult and I know the difference between discipline and abuse. You have always let that boy run his mouth with 0 consequences." I moved the bowl. It slipped. "If you make a thing out of this, I will never forgive you, and neither will Patrick." I read it twice. Then I screenshot it and emailed it to myself. Then I called Patrick. He answered on the first ring. "Lauren, come on," he said immediately, before I had said a word. "You know how she gets. She's embarrassed. She overreacted, okay, she knows that. But you taking Eli out of here like that in front of her friend was humiliating and—" "Eli's cheek is red," I said. "We're at urgent care. There's a medical record." "Silence. She said it was an accident," Patrick said. His voice had changed. He was quieter now, careful. "She said it slipped. A bowl does not slip upward at a 45-degree angle and hit a cabinet 3 feet away." "Patrick, the pasta was hot. It burned him. He's not burned. He has redness and documented irritation on his face and arm from hot food impact. That is on a chart right now with today's date on it." I took a breath. "And I'm going to the police non-emergency line tonight." "Lauren," his voice cracked, "please don't do this. She has never done anything like this before, that you know of," I said. He went quiet again. "I'll call you tomorrow," I said, and I hung up. Eli had fallen asleep in the back seat by the time I got to the precinct. I carried him in, and he drowsed against my shoulder while I gave my statement to an officer named Sergeant Torres, a broad-shouldered man who listened without interruption and asked exactly the right questions. He was particularly interested in the text message. He read it twice. "She says she'll never forgive you if you make this a thing," he said. "Yes. No apology, no acknowledgement of the child's pain." "Correct." He noted everything. He told me they would follow up with Renee directly. He told me that because Eli was a minor and the injury was documented at a medical facility, the case would be logged regardless of whether I pursued it further. He also told me that, given the nature of the text message, I should consider a protection order if the behavior escalated. I drove home. I put Eli to bed. I sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning. To understand why a woman would throw food at a 9-year-old over a homework comparison, you have to understand who Renee is and who she needs her daughter to be. Patrick met Renee 6 years ago, a year after our mom's funeral, when he was at his most untethered, and she was at her most magnetic. She was beautiful, organized, decisive, everything Patrick had never been able to be on his own, and for the first few years I was genuinely grateful to her for stabilizing him. She didn't work outside the home, which was fine, but Renee made motherhood into a performance that required a captive audience and constant applause. Chloe was the vehicle for that performance. She was enrolled in programs and classes and tutored on weekends and taken to academic summer camps. She was being prepared for a future Renee had already written. The problem was that Chloe, who I loved and who was a genuinely sweet kid, was not especially academic. She was creative and sensitive, and she loved art and animals, none of which factored into Renee's vision. She struggled with reading. She cried during math. She was 7 years old and already anxious about failure in a way that made me ache for her. Eli, by contrast, was the kind of kid who read during car rides and asked questions that made his teachers pause. I didn't push him. I didn't have the bandwidth to push him. I worked long hours, and some nights, dinner was cereal, and I helped with homework while still in my work clothes. But Eli was curious and self-directed, and he had thrived in spite of my imperfect schedule, or maybe partly because of it. Renee had not made her feelings about this subtle. At Thanksgiving 2 years ago, she had said, right in front of both kids, that it must be nice not to have standards, because then everything your child did felt like an achievement. At a birthday party, she had given Eli an unsolicited speech about how gifted children who don't receive proper structure end up directionless in adulthood. Small missiles launched with a smile. I had swallowed them. I was busy. Patrick was happy. Chloe and Eli liked each other. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. But my son was 9 years old and he had come home with food thrown at him by an adult, and I was done swallowing things. The next morning, I called my real estate attorney. Her name was Gail, and she had handled the co-ownership agreement when Patrick and I bought the house. I told her what had happened. I told her about the police report and the medical record. I told her I wanted to know my options. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the co-ownership agreement has a conduct clause. Both parties agreed to maintain the property and the household environment in a manner consistent with community standards and free from unlawful activity. Assault on a minor is unlawful activity. Can I force a sale? You can petition for a partition. It would go to court if he doesn't agree to buy you out or sell voluntarily, but given the conduct clause violation and the documented incident, you have a strong foundation to compel action. She paused. The cleaner route is to give him the opportunity to voluntarily buy out your share at fair market value. If he doesn't or can't, you force the sale. Either way, you exit the arrangement. He can't afford to buy me out, I said. He's never been able to afford this house on his own. Then he'll need to sell, Gail said. I sent Patrick a text that evening. I told him I needed to meet with him. I told him not to bring Renee. He showed up the next morning at my apartment looking like he hadn't slept. He probably hadn't. He sat at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I had made him out of habit. And he looked at me with an expression I recognized, the same expression he'd had at our mother's funeral, like he was waiting to be told what to do. She called the school, he said, before I could start. Renee. She called Eli's school yesterday afternoon. She told them she wanted to flag a concern that Eli might be receiving academic coaching that was giving him an unfair advantage over other students. I set my coffee mug down very carefully. She called his school, I said. I didn't know she was going to do it. I swear to you I found out an hour ago. His teacher called me to ask if there was a family conflict they should be aware of, and that's when I realized what she'd done. I reached for my phone and called Gail. I got her voicemail and left a message telling her about the school call and asking her to add it to my file. Then I called the school directly, got the principal, explained the situation, the police report, the medical record, the eviction proceedings, and asked them to document the call they had received and to disregard it entirely. The principal, to her credit, sounded appalled and told me Eli's record spoke entirely for itself. When I got off the phone, Patrick was staring at the table. "She's trying to torpedo my son's academic reputation because she's angry," I said. "That is not a woman who made a mistake. That is a woman who is retaliating against a 9-year-old. "I know," Patrick said quietly. "Do you?" He looked up at me. He had always been the dreamer, the one who needed someone to organize him, and for years I had been afraid that pointing out what Renee was would mean losing him too, the way we had lost our parents. I had been wrong. You don't save someone by pretending not to see the thing that's destroying them. "I need you to buy out my share of the house," I said. "If you can't, we need to list it and split the proceeds." His face went white. "Lauren, I can't be financially entangled with someone who hurt my kid and then attacked his school record. I can't do it. She's my wife. She threw hot food at your nephew and then called his school. What are you going to do about that, Patrick?" He put his head in his hands. He sat like that for a long moment. "I can't buy you out," he said finally, his voice muffled. "You know I can't. Then we sell." He was quiet for a very long time. "Okay," he said. He said it like he was agreeing to something much larger than a real estate transaction, and I think we both understood that he was. Renee did not take the news calmly. She called me 4 times a night, Patrick told her, all of which I let go to voicemail. The messages started at frustrated and escalated to incoherent. She called my mother's sister, who I hadn't spoken to in 2 years, and apparently told her that I was using the house as a weapon to control Patrick and that I'd always resented her for stabilizing him because I needed him to be dependent on me. My aunt called to relay this without much editorial commentary, and I told her plainly what had happened. Gave her the name of the urgent care clinic if she wanted to confirm the medical record herself, and told her I had nothing more to say about it. Renee also went to her social media. She didn't name me, but she posted something about women who use money and property to emotionally abuse their family members, and the comments filled up with support from people who knew nothing. It didn't affect me the way she hoped it would. The only opinions that mattered were in a court file. The permanent restraining order hearing was 6 weeks after the incident. I sat at the petitioner's table with Gail beside me, and across the aisle, Renee was wearing something that communicated vulnerability, the kind of outfit that takes planning. Her attorney, who seemed to be running on very little sleep, argued that the incident had been accidental, that the restraining order was disproportionate, and that I was using the legal system to punish Renee for an imperfect parenting moment because of a long-standing family resentment. The judge, a compact woman named Judge Warren, who looked like she had seen every version of this story, did not appear moved. My attorney presented the urgent care record, the photographs of the redness on Eli's cheek and arm, the transcript of the police report, the screenshot of Renee's text message, and the written statement from Eli's school principal regarding the retaliatory phone call. She laid each document on the table with the particular calm of someone who knows the outcome before the proceeding ends. Renee's attorney tried to argue the school call was not covered under the temporary restraining order because it hadn't involved direct contact with me or Eli. Judge Warren took off her glasses and looked at him. She called a child's school to interfere with his academic standing while a restraining order protecting that child was in effect, she said. "Are you asking me to accept that as incidental behavior?" The attorney did not have a good answer. Then Judge Warren looked at the gallery and found Patrick. He was sitting 2 rows back, his hands laced in his lap, his face very still. She checked her notes, "the respondent's husband. You are the child's uncle and the co-owner of the property in dispute. Do you wish to speak to the court's question about whether the restraining order is warranted?" Renee turned in her seat. I watched it happen. I watched her look at Patrick with the expression I recognized from years of watching her manage him. Not a plea exactly, more like a demand with a soft frame around it. Patrick had spent years answering that expression with compliance. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at his wife, and then he looked at the judge. "My nephew is 9 years old," Patrick said. "He was trying to help my daughter study. My wife threw food at him because she was frustrated. And then when my sister reported it, my wife called the school and tried to damage his record." He paused. "I don't think the restraining order is excessive, Your Honor. I think my nephew deserves to feel safe." The sound Renee made was not a word. Judge Warren granted the permanent restraining order for 3 years. She also recommended a psychological evaluation as a condition of the pending criminal proceedings and noted in her ruling that the retaliatory school call demonstrated a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident, which she would be documenting for the record. Renee was escorted from the courtroom, still speaking at a volume that had stopped being appropriate about 4 sentences in. Patrick did not follow her. He sat back down on the bench and looked at the floor, and I watched my brother, for the first time in 6 years, look like himself. The house sold 8 weeks later. It went for $90,000 more than we had paid for it, which meant my half of the proceeds wiped out the last of my own student loans with enough left over to begin saving for Eli's college fund. Patrick took his half and rented a 2-bedroom apartment in the same school district, 15 minutes from my place. He told me he had filed for divorce 2 days after the hearing. He said he had been ready to file for longer than he wanted to admit, and that watching Renee in that courtroom had removed the last reason he had been holding on to. The criminal case resolved 4 months later. Renee accepted a plea agreement, pleading no contest to misdemeanor battery. She received 18 months of probation, a mandatory anger management program, and 80 hours of community service. She also lost custody of Chloe to Patrick during the divorce proceedings, with supervised visitation while she completed her probation requirements. The family court cited the restraining order, the criminal conviction, and a CPS report that had been filed after the incident as supporting factors. Chloe came to stay with Patrick every other weekend, and in the months that followed, I watched her decompress in real time. She stopped picking at her fingers. She started drawing again, these elaborate, colorful scenes that she'd spread across Patrick's kitchen table and narrate to us while we ate. She was behind on reading, but Patrick's new apartment was around the corner from a public library that had a kids' program on Saturday mornings, and he took her every week, and by spring she was checking out books on her own. Eli, for his part, was quieter than usual for about a month after everything happened. He asked me once, while we were driving, whether Chloe was going to be okay. "Yes," I told him. "She's going to be okay." "Is Uncle Patrick okay?" "He's getting there." He nodded and looked out the window. Then he said, "I wasn't trying to brag, Mom. I was trying to show Chloe how I did the problems so she could copy the steps." I had to keep my eyes on the road for a moment before I trusted myself to speak. "I know that," I said. "I know exactly who you are." I had spent 4 years keeping quiet to preserve a version of family that was already broken. I had subsidized a situation that was hurting the people I loved most, including Patrick, including Chloe, including my son, and including myself. I told myself it was loyalty. It wasn't loyalty. It was avoidance dressed up as generosity, and it had cost all of us more than money. The house Patrick and I had bought with our mother's life insurance was supposed to be her legacy to us, a foundation, a place to grow from. Instead, it had become the thing Renee held over us, the thing that kept me quiet and kept Patrick stuck. Letting it go wasn't a loss. It was the beginning of what that house was always supposed to be, a way forward. Eli started 4th grade in September at the same school, with the same friends and a teacher who had already heard from the principal that he was a kid worth knowing. He brought home a science project in October that took 2 weeks to build and earned him a grade that made his teacher write a personal note at the bottom of the rubric. He showed it to me at the kitchen table. This slightly crumpled piece of paper with a handwritten line at the bottom, and his face had the particular expression of someone who has been seen clearly and is still a little surprised by it. I told him to put it on the refrigerator. Some things are worth protecting, even when protecting them costs everything comfortable and familiar you build around them. Especially then. The image I keep coming back to is Eli standing in that corner between the refrigerator and the wall, shoulders up, hands shaking, spaghetti sauce on his face. 9 years old. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had finished his homework and tried to show his cousin the steps so she could do hers. That was the entire crime. What I understand now, looking back, is that every outcome in this story followed directly from a choice someone made. Renee chose to throw that ball. She chose to send that text without a single word of apology. She chose to call my son's school and try to quietly damage the reputation of a child who had embarrassed her daughter. Each of those choices had a cost, and the cost was real and it was hers to pay. I didn't manufacture the consequences. I just stopped absorbing them on her behalf. I think about who Eli is, and I think that matters here. He is the kind of kid who, in the middle of his own trauma, looked at his cousin and felt bad for her. He wasn't bragging at that table. He was trying to help. That quality in him, that instinct to turn towards someone who's struggling and offer what he has, didn't come from a program or a tutor or a structured curriculum. It came from him choosing, over and over, to be that kind of person. I can take very little credit for it. What I can do is make sure the world around him doesn't punish him for it. What Renee had and ultimately lost was intelligence without integrity. She was organized and perceptive and strategic, and she used every one of those tools in the service of her own ego rather than her daughter's actual well-being. Chloe didn't need more tutors. She needed a mother who could tolerate her being ordinary at math and extraordinary at drawing, and Renee could never give her that. The sharpness was there. The wisdom wasn't. Patrick is the part of this story I sit with the longest. He knew, earlier than he admitted, that something was wrong. He stayed anyway, not out of love, exactly, but out of exhaustion and habit, and the particular kind of fear that comes from not knowing who you are without a difficult person organizing your life around them. What took courage wasn't leaving. It was standing up in that courtroom and saying the true thing out loud when saying the false thing would have been so much easier. That one moment of moral backbone changed everything for him and for Chloe both. I spent 4 years keeping quiet because I told myself it was the kind thing to do. It wasn't. Real steadiness, the kind that actually protects the people you love, sometimes requires you to stop making yourself smaller to keep someone else comfortable. I had the resources and the documentation and the legal standing to act, and I waited too long to use them, and that waiting cost my son a frightening afternoon and a month of being quieter than he should have been. What I learned is not complicated. The choices you make when you are tired and scared and trying to hold something fragile together do not disappear. They accumulate. Renee's accumulated into a courtroom and a criminal record and a custody arrangement she never saw coming. Mine accumulated into a sold house and a clean start and a kid who put a teacher's handwritten note on the refrigerator and stood back to look at it with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. You don't have to be ruthless to protect what matters. You just have to stop pretending you didn't see what you saw.